Song of Resistance. The bookstore smelled of paper and polish, but on Friday nights, it smelled like something more, like sweat, wood, and the faint metallic breath of a saxophone. Greenwood had found its gathering place again, and Marcus had discovered the power of rhythm. It started small. A trio of old musicians, their suits worn, their cases patched with tape, came one evening when Miss Evelyn suggested it. They set up in the corner by the poetry shelf. The first note of the saxophone rose like a cry, shaky at first, then steady. The upright bass hummed low. The drum brushed time like a heartbeat. People came. First in twos, then in clusters. They pushed back chairs, leaned against bookshelves, stood shoulder to shoulder. And as the music filled the room, something ancient returned, not just entertainment, but resistance. Miss Evelyn whispered, "They tried to burn our voices once. But they can't burn sound." For Marcus, the music wasn't just background. It was a language. He watched children tapping their shoes, elders nodding slow, and young couples holding hands as if the rhythm stitched them together. He thought about his grandfather, who never spoke much about Tulsa 1921 but always hummed old blues tunes when repairing shoes. Music had been memory. Music had been shield. But not everyone came to listen. One evening, just as the saxophonist leaned into a high note that cut the air like glass, the door creaked. Two uniformed officers stepped inside. Their boots echoed against the wooden floor, their eyes cold, their posture deliberate. They didn't smile. They didn't greet. They simply leaned against the frame and watched. The music faltered, for a second. The drummer's brush skipped. The saxophonist's lip trembled. People shifted, uncomfortable, whispers rising like static. Marcus stood up. He caught the musician's eyes and nodded. "Play." The saxophonist closed his eyes, drew a long breath, and let out a wail so sharp it seemed to scrape the ceiling. The bass thumped harder, the drum found its heartbeat again. The sound grew bold, loud, defiant. The officers stayed a while, unmoving, their presence heavy. But the music refused to bow. The crowd clapped louder, feet stomped, hands snapped, the bookstore transformed into a pulsing body of rhythm and defiance. When the officers finally walked out, smirking, the room erupted in cheers. Not just because they left, but because they had not silenced them. Miss Evelyn leaned close to Marcus and whispered, "Every note they play is a fight they can't win." And Marcus realized, this wasn't just about books. It wasn't about brick and mortar. Greenwood needed this sound. It needed joy that was sharpened into resistance. It needed a spirit too alive to be choked. That night, as the music bled into laughter and clinking teacups, Marcus sat back and whispered to himself, "We are still here. And they will hear us." Shadows on the wall. The jazz had barely faded from the bookstore when Marcus began to notice them, shadows that did not belong to the night. It started with the phone. A faint click whenever Miss Evelyn picked up, as though another ear pressed in. She joked about it, "Honey, I've lived long enough to know when somebody's got their finger on the line," but the look in her eyes said she didn't find it funny. Then came the men in the car. A black sedan that parked across from the bookstore 2, sometimes 3 nights a week. The engine never turned off, and its headlights glared too long into the glass windows. When Marcus walked outside, the car eased away, smooth as a shadow slipping back into the dark. And finally, there were the papers. City notices suddenly stapled to the lamppost, fire safety violations pending. Unauthorized gatherings. All stamped official, all delivered with speed that felt personal. The community noticed too. Customers whispered it between the shelves. Mothers looked around twice before letting their children run to the corner shop. The joy of music still filled the bookstore, but an undercurrent of unease grew thicker each night. One evening, Marcus locked up late. The jazz had ended, the chairs were stacked, the smell of coffee lingered in the air. Outside, the street was quiet. Too quiet. He stepped into the alley and froze. On the wall, painted in hurried strokes of red, were words meant to bruise. Know your place. The paint dripped like blood. His jaw tightened. He scanned the shadows, the alley silent except for the faint hum of a streetlight. Someone had been here. Someone had stood in the dark, close enough to touch the door, close enough to spit their warning. Miss Evelyn found him staring at the wall the next morning. She said nothing at first. Just ran her wrinkled hand across the dripping letters, smudging red into her palm. Then she whispered, almost to herself, they used to burn it. Now they just paint it. Same message, different brush. Marcus wanted to shout. He wanted to punch through the wall, to hunt the shadows, to break the silence. But Evelyn placed her hand on his chest and said, don't let them choose the fight. We fight where we are strong. That night, Marcus sat awake in the bookstore, lights dimmed, listening. Every creak of the wood felt like footsteps, every rattle of the window like a whisper. Fear pressed against him like a weight, but alongside it, something else burned, anger, hot and alive. He remembered his grandfather's words, they don't need to chain you if they can scare you into chaining yourself. Marcus rose, pulled out a bucket, soap, and rag, and began scrubbing the wall. The paint fought back, staining his hands red, clinging to the brick like dried blood. But he didn't stop. He scrubbed until his muscles ached, until sweat ran down his back. When dawn broke, the words were gone. Only faint shadows of pink remained, a scar instead of an open wound. As the sun rose, children passed on their way to school. They slowed, staring at Marcus, his shirt soaked, his hands raw, his face set with determination. One boy asked, "Mister, why you out here so early?" Marcus looked at him, then at the freshly scrubbed wall. He smiled faintly. Because some things you don't leave for morning. The boy nodded, wide-eyed, as if he'd been handed a lesson bigger than the wall itself. But the shadows did not stop. One evening during a crowded jazz session, the lights flickered, once, twice, then snapped off. The room plunged into darkness. A scream cut through the music. Someone stumbled into a shelf, books tumbled to the ground. Children cried. Marcus fumbled for the breaker. When the lights returned, the officers were already at the door, clipboards in hand. One of them smirked as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Overcrowded. Unsafe. Fire hazard, he said. His pen scratched across the paper like a knife carving wood. The community rallied instantly, arguing, pleading, standing shoulder to shoulder. Miss Evelyn, tiny but unyielding, jabbed her finger toward the officer's chest. We built this place to outlast you, and we will. Write your paper, but we'll still be here tomorrow. The officer only smirked wider. We'll see about that. When they left, the music didn't resume. The instruments lay silent, the bass leaning against the shelf, the drumsticks resting like broken branches. Fear had entered the room like smoke. Marcus knew what the shadows wanted. They wanted Greenwood to silence itself. To choke on its own fear. To fold before the fire ever came. And standing there in the dim light, Marcus made a vow. If they were shadows, then he would be the flame.